In the quiet hills of Kentucky, on a cold December morning in 1809, a baby cried his first breath into a world that would one day whisper his name across the mountains of the Wild West. His name was Christopher Houston Carson, but the world would come to know him simply as Kit Carson, a name that would echo in every campfire tale and every dusty trail of the American frontier. Kit was born into a poor but hard-working family. His parents, Lindsay and Rebecca Carson, had a large family, 14 children in total, and every one of them learned the value of survival early. Life on the frontier was never easy. Food was scarce. Winters were long, and every day was a fight to stay alive. When Kit was just a young boy, tragedy struck. His father died in a sudden accident, leaving his mother to raise the children alone. There was no time for dreams, no time for schooling. The Carsons had to work the land, chop the wood, and pray the crops would grow. But deep inside that quiet, small boy, there was something different. A spark. A hunger for the unknown. A desire to see what lay beyond the hills. As Kit grew, stories began to reach his ears. Stories told by travelers, trappers, and soldiers passing through Missouri, where the Carson family had moved. They spoke of lands that stretched farther than the eye could see, of rivers wider than dreams and mountains that touched the sky. To most boys, these were just tall tales, but to Kit, they were a call, a whisper of destiny. He wasn't much for books or classrooms. In fact, Kit never learned to read or write properly, but he had something better, instinct. He could track animals, sense weather changes, and find his way through the forest by the sound of the wind. He was a child of the wilderness even before he ever set foot in it. At the age of 14, Kit's mother sent him to learn a trade, an apprenticeship with a saddle maker in Franklin, Missouri. Franklin wasn't a big town, but it was buzzing with life. It sat right on the edge of the American frontier, a gateway to the untamed West. Traders, hunters, and explorers passed through daily, their wagons packed with furs, rifles, and dreams of adventure. As Kit stitched leather and polished saddles, he listened to their stories, tales of wild buffalo herds, fierce native warriors, and golden sunsets over lands no white man had ever claimed. Every tale made his hands tremble with excitement. Every night he dreamed of mountains and freedom. He knew he didn't belong behind a workbench. His heart was already out there, riding the open plains. Then, one day in the summer of 1826, at just 16 years old, Kit made a decision that would change his life forever. He packed his few belongings, left behind the saddle shop, and walked away from everything he knew. No letter, no goodbye, just the open road and the horizon calling his name. That day, the boy became a traveler. He joined a caravan of fur trappers heading west toward Santa Fe, a dangerous journey across wild, uncharted lands filled with bandits, storms, and deadly terrain. For most men, it was madness. For Kit, it was freedom. The journey tested every ounce of his courage. Nights were freezing. Days were burning hot. Food ran low, and danger seemed to wait behind every ridge. But Kit never complained. He watched, learned, and adapted. By the time they reached Taos, New Mexico, he was no longer a boy from Missouri. He was a frontiersman. He had survived the wild, earned his place among hardened trappers, and proven he could stand on his own. In Taos, he found a new world, one filled with color, culture, and language. The town was a crossroads of civilizations, Native American, Spanish, and American. Kit, curious and humble, learned to speak Spanish and native languages like Navajo and Apache. He traded furs, hunted in the mountains, and began to build a reputation as a man of skill and courage. He wasn't loud or boastful like other trappers. He didn't drink much or brag about his adventures. He preferred silence, the company of nature, and the friendship of those who earned his trust. To the locals, he was just Carson. To his fellow trappers, he was becoming a legend in the making. But life in the wilderness was not just adventure, it was survival. Every day Kit faced new challenges, harsh winters, starvation, and the constant threat of attack. There were no laws out here, no second chances. One wrong step, one bad choice, and you could vanish into the wilderness forever. Still, Kit endured. He learned the ways of the mountain men, how to trap beavers for their pelts, how to build shelters in snow, and how to navigate by the stars. He learned respect for nature, for animals, and for the native tribes who called the land home. Over the years, he earned the trust of the people he met, from trappers to chiefs. He became known not just for his bravery, but for his honesty and fairness. When others cheated or fought, Carson found peace. When others feared the wild, Carson found a home within it. By his early 20s, Kit Carson had traveled through what are now Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and California, long before maps even existed for those lands. He had faced grizzly bears, crossed deserts, and outsmarted enemies. He had become everything he dreamed of as a boy, free, fearless, and alive. Yet deep inside, he still felt something missing. He had proven himself as a man of the mountains, but his destiny was only beginning. Soon, a meeting would change everything, a chance encounter with an ambitious explorer named John C. Fremont. Together, they would map the unknown, conquer the impossible, and write their names into history. But that's a story for another time. Because before Kit Carson became a hero, he had to first survive the wilderness and learn what it truly means to be free. The year was 1826. A young man named Kit Carson, just 16 years old, had crossed into a world most people only heard about in stories. The frontier, wild, vast, and unforgiving, a place where rules meant nothing, and survival meant everything. Kit rode with a caravan of fur traders and trappers, rough men with hard eyes, their faces marked by sun and scars. They carried rifles, traps, and courage in equal measure. Every mile west was a test, every night a gamble against nature. The prairies stretched endlessly before them, seas of grass that whispered under the wind. Sometimes the silence was so deep it made your heart beat louder. Other times thunder rolled across the plains, lightning cracking open the sky. To many, this land was terrifying. But to Kit Carson, it was freedom. He had no past to run from, no future to plan. Just open space and the promise of adventure. The journey to Santa Fe, New Mexico was long and brutal. They faced storms, wild animals, and the constant threat of attack. One night, their camp was surrounded by Comanche warriors, silent shadows in the tall grass. Kit held his breath, clutching his rifle, ready for death. But the trappers negotiated peace, trading blankets and knives for safe passage. It was Carson's first lesson in the ways of the West. Out here, survival wasn't just about strength, it was about respect. When the caravan finally reached Taos, Kit saw a world unlike anything he'd known. Bright adobe houses baked in the sun, Spanish music drifting through the streets, native traders offering furs, beads, and silver, and the smell of chili peppers and dust in the air. This was no longer Missouri. This was the edge of civilization, a land of many tongues and many tribes. Kit fell in love with it instantly. He began learning Spanish, picking up words quickly from locals. Soon he could speak it fluently, something few white men could do. Then he learned Navajo and Apache, understanding their culture, humor, and pain. He wasn't like most trappers who looked down on native people. Kit listened, learned, and respected them. And that respect would one day save his life. Over the next few years, Carson joined trapping expeditions that took him deep into the Rocky Mountains. They hunted beavers for their valuable pelts, trading them for supplies in Taos and Santa Fe. But trapping was dangerous work. Men drowned in icy rivers, froze in snowstorms, or vanished without a trace. Every man carried his rifle, his knife, and his fear. But Kit carried something more. Calm. He had a stillness that others trusted. Even in chaos, he kept his head. If a storm hit, he found shelter. If a man was injured, he patched him up. If food ran out, he hunted. Kit Carson didn't just survive the wilderness, he understood it. By the 1830s, his reputation had begun to spread. Trappers spoke of him in admiration. "Carson," they'd say around the fire. "He's the one who never gets lost." Some called him lucky. Others said he could smell water miles away or track a deer by a single bent blade of grass. But to Kit, it wasn't luck. It was awareness, a deep connection to the land. He once spent 3 days following the trail of a wounded comrade through a blizzard, refusing to give up until he found him. He carried the man back to camp on his shoulders, half frozen but alive. That night, the men called him a ghost of the mountains, a man who could walk between worlds and come back unbroken. Yet even heroes have scars. Kit saw death more times than he could count. He buried friends in shallow graves beneath pine trees, marking the earth with a pile of stones. He fought off wolves that circled his camp at night. He once faced a charging grizzly bear and killed it with a single shot, but not before it nearly tore his arm apart. The wild didn't care about legends. It demanded strength, humility, and a will to fight another day. In Taos, when the trapping season ended, Kit found small moments of peace. He shared meals with locals, danced at festivals, and listened to travelers tell tales of faraway lands. It was during one of these times that he met a young Arapaho woman named Singing Grass. She was gentle, wise, and brave, and she saw in Kit something few others did: kindness. They married in a traditional ceremony, uniting two worlds that rarely understood each other. For the first time, Kit Carson felt like he belonged, not to a town, not to a tribe, but to something greater. A life built on love, trust, and respect for the land. Together they had 2 daughters. Kit worked the trap lines, hunted game, and returned to her every season. He had found balance, a peaceful rhythm in the heart of chaos, but the frontier never allowed peace for long. In 1840, tragedy struck again. Singing Grass fell ill and passed away, leaving Kit heartbroken and lost. For days he didn't speak. He rode alone through the mountains, visiting the rivers they once camped beside. The land that once brought him joy now felt empty. When he returned to Taos, people said he had changed. His eyes carried the weight of the wild, deep, silent, and unshakable. From that pain, a new chapter began. Kit Carson would soon be called to greater things, not as a trapper, but as a guide and scout for a man whose ambition matched the size of the West itself. That man's name was John C. Fremont. Their meeting would ignite a new era of exploration and turn Kit Carson from a mountain man into a legend of American history. By the early 1840s, Kit Carson had already lived more adventure than most men ever dreamed of. He had fought storms, hunted grizzly bears, crossed frozen rivers, and survived battles no man should walk away from. But his next chapter, the one that would make his name legendary, was about to begin. In the spring of 1842, fate led him to a chance encounter on a dusty trail near St. Louis. Kit had taken a job as a wagon driver, carrying goods east from New Mexico. At a small outpost, he overheard a young officer talking excitedly about exploring the American West, a man with bright eyes and restless ambition. That man was John C. Fremont, a U.S. Army lieutenant, surveyor, and dreamer. He planned to lead a government expedition to map the Rocky Mountains and record the uncharted wilderness beyond. When Fremont met Kit Carson, he saw something rare: calm confidence and a quiet fire that couldn't be faked. And when Carson spoke, he spoke little, but every word carried weight. Fremont didn't hesitate. He looked at Kit and said, "I need a man who knows the wild, someone who can lead us where maps end." And Carson replied simply, "I can do that." It was the beginning of a partnership that would shape the destiny of the American frontier. The first expedition set out in 1842. Their mission, to map the South Pass, a key route through the Rocky Mountains used by pioneers heading west. For Fremont, it was a scientific journey. For Kit, it was just another ride through the wilderness, except this time he carried the lives of 20 men on his shoulders. They crossed rivers swollen with snowmelt, camped beneath the stars, and fought through freezing rain. When others lost hope, Carson never did. He guided them through mountain passes no map had ever named, reading the land like a book. Every sunrise brought new danger. Every night, Kit checked the horses, studied the stars, and listened to the wind. He could tell the weather by the scent of the air, find water where the ground looked dry, and sense enemies before they struck. To Fremont, he wasn't just a guide. He was the heart of the expedition. When they finally reached the summit of the Wind River Range, Fremont climbed the highest peak and planted the American flag. Below him, Kit stood silently, looking out over a sea of mountains. He didn't need glory. He just needed the journey. When the expedition returned safely, Fremont wrote glowing reports about Kit Carson, describing him as a brave, skilled, and loyal frontiersman. Those reports spread fast, printed in newspapers across the country. Overnight, Kit Carson became a national hero. But Carson wasn't in it for fame. While others told tales of his courage, he returned quietly to Taos, living simply. Yet adventure always found him. The next year, Fremont called again, this time for a second expedition. This journey would take them farther, across the Rocky Mountains, through Utah, and into the Sierra Nevada. They faced blizzards, hunger, and exhaustion. At times, men thought they'd die in the snow, but Carson kept them alive, finding game, setting traps, and keeping morale high. When the mules collapsed from cold, he shared his own rations. When the path vanished, he carved a new one. In his journal, Fremont wrote, "Carson has the rare skill to find the way when there is no way." Their friendship deepened. Fremont was bold, educated, and full of ambition. Carson was quiet, humble, and guided by instinct. Together they were unstoppable, science and survival walking side by side. When they finally reached California, it was wild and ungoverned, ruled by nature, danger, and dreams. Carson's courage during these travels earned him respect not just from Americans, but from native tribes and Mexican settlers alike. He often served as peacemaker, translating between groups, calming tensions, and preventing bloodshed. He believed the frontier didn't have to be endless war, that there could be understanding. But peace was fragile, and war was always one mistake away. By 1844, after months of hardship, the expedition returned east. The men were changed, thinner, harder, older. But Carson was unbroken. He had seen deserts no white man had crossed, peaks no one had named, and rivers no map had marked. The world called him a hero of the wilderness. Books and newspapers began romanticizing his name. Dime novels painted him as a fearless gunslinger, a superhuman tracker who could outfight armies and wrestle bears. But Kit laughed at those tales. He knew the truth. Real courage wasn't about glory. It was about survival, loyalty, and doing what was right when no one was watching. Still, fame followed him. In cities like St. Louis and Washington, people stared when he walked by. Some even asked for his autograph, though he couldn't write. He'd simply draw an X and nod. Despite his growing fame, Kit missed the open land. He didn't belong in parlors or fancy hotels. He belonged to the mountains, where silence spoke louder than words. But peace never lasted for long in Kit's life. Soon, Fremont called for a third expedition, this time with a secret mission, to explore the Western Territories and lay the groundwork for American control of California, which was still under Mexican rule. This journey would be the most dangerous of all. Ahead lay storms, battles, and betrayal, and Kit would soon find himself in the middle of a revolution. The quiet mountain man was about to become a soldier of destiny. Music rises, slow drums, wind whistling through canyons. He had no idea that his next steps would carry him straight into war, fame, and heartbreak. But as always, Kit Carson was ready. Because wherever the trail led, whether through blood or snow, he had one rule that never changed. Go forward. Always forward. The year was 1846. The sun rose red over the desert, painting the sky in the colors of war. The United States and Mexico were on the edge of conflict. And once again, Kit Carson found himself standing where history was being written. After years of guiding John C. Fremont through the untamed West, Kit thought he had seen everything: mountains, storms, hunger, and death. But war was different. War didn't test just your strength. It tested your soul. When Fremont received secret orders to move into California, Carson was at his side. California was still Mexican territory, but American settlers there were restless, dreaming of independence. Whispers of rebellion echoed through the valleys. Soon, those whispers became gunfire. Kit Carson wasn't a politician. He didn't care about borders or politics. He cared about people, about keeping his men alive. Still, when the time came, he did his duty. As Fremont led his troops across rugged passes and scorching deserts, Carson was their guide, their compass in chaos. He found water where others found death. He led them through ambushes, scouted enemy movements, and warned of danger before it arrived. The men trusted him completely. To them, Carson wasn't just a guide. He was the difference between life and death. One night near the Sacramento River, his instincts saved the expedition. While the men slept, Carson felt the earth tremble beneath his bedroll. He rose quietly, scanning the darkness. In the distance, shadows moved, riders. He woke Fremont instantly. Moments later, a band of hostile fighters charged their camp. Thanks to Carson's warning, the soldiers were ready. When the battle ended, the camp was safe, and Fremont knew again that without Kit Carson, None of them would have lived to see another sunrise. Soon after, the Bear Flag Revolt began. American settlers declared California independent from Mexico, raising a crude flag painted with a grizzly bear. Carson helped carry messages, guided troops, and ensured the safe movement of families through dangerous territory. But peace was short-lived. War officially broke out between the U.S. and Mexico, and the entire region exploded in violence. Fremont forces were ordered south to join General Stephen Kearny, who was marching toward San Diego. Carson was chosen as scout, because no one knew the land like he did. What followed was one of the most dangerous journeys of his life. The desert between New Mexico and California was a hell of sand, heat, and emptiness. Kearny's men suffered hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. They lost horses, then mules, then their strength. But Carson pressed on. He hunted for food, found hidden springs, and kept the men moving forward. At one point, he was sent ahead with 2 companions to deliver a message to San Diego, a mission through enemy lines. They traveled silently, mostly at night, hiding by day. Carson knew that if they were caught, death would be slow. But he made it through, barefoot at one point, after his boots wore out, and completed the mission. His courage saved hundreds of lives. When he returned to the American lines, soldiers greeted him with cheers. Even the hardened officers called him a hero. But Kit never saw himself that way. When asked about his bravery, he simply said, "I just did what needed doing." After the war ended, Kit returned to Taos, New Mexico, hoping for peace. He had fought, guided, and survived enough for one lifetime. He married Josefa Jaramillo, a young woman from a respected Taos family. She was gentle, kind, and full of life. Their home became a warm place filled with love, laughter, and the smell of home-cooked food, a rare comfort for a man who had spent most of his life under the open sky. For the first time, Kit Carson felt something new, belonging. But even as he tried to live quietly, the legend of Kit Carson grew. Stories of his bravery spread like wildfire. Dime novels, sold in towns across America, told wild tales of Kit Carson, the fearless Indian fighter and mountain man. They turned him into a myth, part truth, part fiction. Readers imagined him as a giant of a man, unstoppable and unafraid. In reality, Carson was small and modest, soft-spoken and deeply humble. He didn't crave fame. He only wanted to provide for his family and live in peace. But peace in the Old West was a fragile dream. By the late 1850s, the frontier was changing fast. Settlers poured west by the thousands, chasing land and fortune. Tension with native tribes grew worse each year. The government needed someone they could trust, someone who understood both sides. That man was Kit Carson. He was appointed Indian agent for the Ute and Apache tribes, a role few white men could ever fill with fairness. Carson used his influence to protect native families from dishonest traders and broken promises. He spoke to them in their own languages, earning respect from chiefs and warriors alike. He tried to keep peace where others only wanted war. But he was walking a tightrope, between duty and conscience, between compassion and command. At night, sitting beside Josefa, Kit would sometimes stare into the fire, lost in thought. He had seen too much death, too many dreams turned to dust. And deep down, he knew the peace he worked for couldn't last. The land was changing, faster than anyone could control. And soon new storms would rise, storms that would test not just Kit's courage, but his heart. By the late 1840s, Kit Carson had done what few men could. He had survived the wild, crossed deserts, mapped mountains, and fought wars. He was a legend now, his name printed in newspapers and adventure books, his face recognized in towns across the frontier. But behind that fame, behind the rough exterior of the mountain man, there was a heart, a quiet heart that longed for peace, love, and home. When Kit returned to Taos, New Mexico, after years of war and exploration, he found the world changing. The town had grown. More settlers, more soldiers, more noise. But to him, Taos was still a small piece of heaven, a place where cultures met and lived side by side, where Spanish songs drifted through adobe streets and the mountains watched silently from afar. It was here that Kit met Josefa Jaramillo, a young woman from one of the most respected families in Taos. She was just 17. Graceful, intelligent, and full of life. He was in his late 30s, quiet, rugged and battle-worn. Yet somehow their souls met in the middle. At first, people gossiped. What would a young lady of good family want with a rough frontiersman? But Josefa saw something in Kit that others couldn't: honesty. He wasn't a man of fancy words or grand gestures. He was gentle, loyal, and real. Kit loved her deeply but was unsure of her family's approval. Still, he gathered his courage and went to ask for her hand. To everyone's surprise, they agreed. They saw in him not just a frontiersman, but a man of honor and bravery. On a bright spring morning in 1843, Kit Carson and Josefa were married in the old church of Taos. Friends, soldiers, traders, and townsfolk filled the pews. Outside, the mountains stood like silent witnesses. As the bells rang, Kit looked at his bride and whispered, "You are my home." For the first time in his life, Carson had peace. He built a small house for Josefa, adobe walls, a warm hearth, and a yard full of flowers she loved to tend. When he wasn't traveling or scouting, he spent his days at home, chopping wood, fixing saddles, and holding his newborn children in his arms. Josefa gave him happiness that no adventure ever could. Together they had 8 children, though not all survived infancy, a painful reminder of how harsh life still was in the West. Kit would sit by the fire, telling his little ones stories about the mountains, about buffalo hunts, and about the stars that guided him through endless nights. To them he wasn't a hero, he was just father. To Josefa, he wasn't the famous scout or soldier, he was simply her Kit. But peace, as always, was fleeting. Duty called again. The U.S. Army often needed him, as a scout, a translator, or a mediator with native tribes. And though he hated leaving his family, Kit never said no when his country asked. He rode away many times, always promising Josefa he'd return. And he always did, until one journey nearly broke him. In 1854, Kit led a small group through the mountains on a dangerous mission. A sudden blizzard trapped them for days. They ran out of food, and frostbite took their strength. When they finally returned to Taos, half dead from the cold, Josefa ran into his arms, crying with relief. For weeks, she nursed him back to health. That winter, Kit vowed he would never again let fame or duty come before family. But the West had its own plans. The years that followed were hard. Native conflicts grew worse as settlers pushed deeper into tribal lands. Carson, who spoke their languages and understood their struggles, was often torn between two worlds. He wanted peace, but peace was slipping away. Through all of it, Josefa remained his anchor, his voice of reason, his light in the storm. When others called him to war, she reminded him of mercy. When fame tempted him, she reminded him of home. She once said to him softly, "You've walked across every mountain, Kit. Now walk home to us." And he tried. Between missions, he spent as much time as possible at home, holding his children, listening to their laughter, watching the sunsets fade behind the mountains of Taos. But time, like the wind, never stands still. The 1860s brought new storms, the Civil War, and later the Navajo campaign that would forever haunt Kit's name. War pulled him away once more, leaving Josefa alone to keep the family strong. She never complained, though her letters to him, filled with love and fear, revealed how deeply she missed him. Kit carried those letters with him through battle and blood, reading them by firelight when loneliness became too heavy. Her words gave him strength and reminded him of what he was fighting to come back to. When the wars finally ended, Kit returned to Taos older, quieter, and weary. He had served his country faithfully, but his soul was tired. He dreamed only of rest, of time with Josefa and their children, and for a few brief years he got that peace. They moved to Boggsville, Colorado, near the Arkansas River, where the land was green and gentle. Kit worked the fields, played with his children, and spent long evenings with Josefa watching the sun set over the plains. For the first time in decades, he smiled easily again. But happiness, for Kit Carson, was always followed by loss. In the spring of 1868, tragedy struck. Josefa gave birth to their 8th child, a healthy baby girl. But complications followed. Within hours, she grew weak. Despite every effort, she passed away in Kit's arms. He was shattered. Friends said he aged years in a single night. He sat by her side, silent, for hours, holding her hand long after her last breath. A month later, Kit fell gravely ill himself. His heart, weakened by grief, began to fail. On May 23, 1868, he whispered his final words. "Goodbye, friends. Adios, compadres." And just like that, the wild spirit of the frontier went still. By the early 1860s, America was burning. The Civil War had torn the nation apart. Brother fighting brother, North against South. But far from the great battlefields of Virginia and Gettysburg, another kind of war was brewing, one that would scar the desert forever, and once again, the name Kit Carson would be written into it. When the Civil War began, Carson was living quietly in Taos with his wife Josefa and their growing family. He wanted no part in the bloodshed. He was tired of killing, tired of orders, tired of watching men die. But the frontier was never far from chaos. In 1861, New Mexico became a battleground. Confederate forces from Texas marched west, hoping to claim the territory for the South. The Union needed men who knew the land, men who could fight, scout, and survive the desert. They turned to Kit Carson. Under Carson's leadership, the volunteers fought bravely in the Battle of Valverde and other skirmishes. He was no strategist in a fancy uniform. He was a soldier of the land. He rode at the front, not the back, and his men followed him because they trusted him with their lives. But when the Confederate threat faded, another order came. One that would change everything. The U.S. government wanted to end raids by Navajo and Apache tribes who resisted the spread of settlers and forts into their homeland. They blamed the tribes for violence, though much of it had been provoked by broken treaties and encroaching settlers. The army wanted the land cleared, by peace if possible, by force if not, and the man chosen to lead that campaign was Colonel Kit Carson. For Carson, this was the hardest command of his life. He knew the Navajo. He had traded with them, shared fires with them, even counted some as friends. He respected their courage and culture. But orders were orders, and in 1863, those orders were clear. Drive the Navajo from their homeland and force them onto a reservation. The campaign began in the harsh desert of Canyon de Chelly, deep in modern-day Arizona. It was one of the most beautiful and most sacred places in the Southwest. Towering red cliffs, hidden caves, fields of corn and peach orchards. It was the Navajo heartland, and Carson was about to tear it apart. He didn't relish it. He didn't cheer or boast. He followed orders with heavy silence. His men destroyed crops, cut down orchards, and burned homes to push the Navajo out of hiding. The army called it total war. To the Navajo, it was devastation. By early 1864, thousands of Navajo people, men, women, and children, surrendered, starving and broken. The army forced them to march more than 300 miles east to a camp called Bosque Redondo. The journey became known as the Long Walk. Over 8,000 Navajo began that march. Hundreds died from hunger, cold, and exhaustion before reaching the end. Those who survived found nothing but misery, poor land, bad water, and disease. It was one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American West. Kit Carson followed his orders to the letter, but history would never forget what happened. Some saw him as a hero who brought peace to the frontier. Others saw him as a destroyer, the man who broke the Navajo nation. In truth, Carson was neither. He was a soldier trapped between compassion and command, doing what he thought duty demanded, yet carrying the weight of it for the rest of his life. He once said quietly, "I did not like it. But it was my duty as a soldier." Those who knew him said the campaign haunted him until his final days. He tried to help the tribes afterward, bringing food, supplies, and medicine, but the damage had already been done. No gesture could erase the suffering. After the Navajo were removed, Carson continued to serve as a peacekeeper in the region. He negotiated treaties, helped settle disputes, and tried to restore order between settlers and tribes. But his heart was tired. The man who once rode fearlessly across the mountains now carried invisible wounds. He had fought in nearly every kind of war the West could offer, against nature, men, and himself. He was no longer just a legend. He was a survivor, one who had seen the best and worst of humanity. When Carson returned home, Josefa noticed the change. He was quieter. He smiled less. Sometimes she would find him sitting outside long after sunset, staring at the horizon where the mountains met the sky. When she asked what he was thinking, he would only say, "About the people, the ones who never came back." He didn't say who, because there were too many. friends, soldiers, Navajo, and enemies alike, all lost to the endless hunger of the frontier. In 1865, Carson left the army for good. He was promoted to brigadier general, but the title meant little to him. He didn't wear the medals, didn't brag about his rank. He returned to his family, to Josefa and their children, hoping to find peace before his strength ran out. The world called him a hero. But Kit Carson never saw himself that way. He once told a friend, "A hero? No, I've only done what was asked of me, and I wish I could forget some of it." The year was 1865. The war was over. The guns had gone silent. But inside Kit Carson, the battle never stopped. He had survived war after war, crossed deserts and mountains, faced enemies and beasts. Yet now, his greatest struggle was not with men, but with memory. After the Navajo campaign, the army called him a hero. Newspapers printed his name beside words like victory and peace. But Carson felt none of it. He saw no victory, only faces he could not forget. The starving, the freezing, the endless line of people walking through the dust toward Bosque Redondo. At night, he woke up sweating, hearing their cries. When he closed his eyes, he saw the long trail again, not as a soldier, but as a witness. He had followed orders, but in his heart, he wondered if that was enough to make it right. In Taos, he returned to Josefa and his children, trying to bury the past under simple work, chopping wood, tending the horses, mending fences. But peace was hard to find. He would sit by the fire for hours, saying nothing, staring into the flames like they could burn the memories away. Josefa tried to comfort him. She told him he had done his duty, that he had no choice. But Kit's silence said otherwise. The man who once spoke with the calm certainty of a scout now seemed lost, like a traveler with no map left to follow. That same year, he received new orders, but these were different. He was asked to serve as commander of Fort Garland in southern Colorado. This time, he wasn't going to fight. He was going to protect. The land was tense, settlers clashing with the Ute tribe, who were angry and frightened as their lands disappeared under new farms and forts. Carson knew both worlds. He spoke their languages. He understood their pain. He accepted the post, not to wage war, but to prevent one. When he arrived at Fort Garland, the soldiers expected a hard, loud officer. Instead, they met a quiet man with tired eyes and a gentle voice. He told them, "The Ute are not our enemies. They are our neighbors. Treat them fair, and we'll have peace." He met often with Ute leaders, including the respected Chief Ouray. They sat together for hours, speaking of land, hunting, and broken promises. Carson listened more than he spoke. He promised to carry their words to the government, to fight for better treatment. He couldn't undo what had been done to the Navajo, but he could still protect those who remained. In time, he became one of the few men the Ute trusted. They called him the White Chief with a kind heart. He arranged food for starving families and stopped soldiers from raiding their villages. He even punished settlers who stole from them. Slowly, peace returned to the region. And for the first time in years, Kit Carson began to heal. Yet the West was changing faster than anyone could stop it. Railroads cut across the plains. Buffalo herds vanished. New towns rose where forests once stood. To many native people, it felt like the end of the world. Carson watched it all unfold with sadness. He had once been the symbol of exploration and progress. Now he saw what that progress had cost. He told a friend, "I sometimes think the land itself cries for what's been lost." In those quiet years, Carson grew older and weaker. The adventures that once filled him with excitement now felt like distant dreams. His hair turned gray, his hands stiff from old injuries, his lungs weak from the cold winters of the mountains. But he never stopped working. Even when sick, he still rode out to visit tribes, help settlers, and settle disputes. He had no interest in wealth or praise. He just wanted to leave the world a little more peaceful than he found it. Sometimes he spoke to his oldest son about the old days. He didn't brag or tell tall tales like the dime novels did. Instead, he spoke quietly about the lessons he had learned. "Respect the land," he said. "Never look down on another man because he's different. And remember, every trail you take leaves tracks behind. Choose them wisely." Those words weren't for fame or glory. They were a confession. From a man who had seen both greatness and guilt. In the evenings, Kit and Josefa would sit on the porch, watching the sunset over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The sky would blaze orange and red, the same colors that once painted his battlefields. But now, those colors meant peace. Josefa would rest her head on his shoulder, and for a while, the world would grow quiet again. He'd whisper, This is what I was fighting for all along." But life on the frontier never stayed calm for long. Even as he worked for peace, his health declined. Years of exhaustion and hardship had taken their toll. He coughed often, his breath short. Doctors called it aneurysm of the aorta, an unseen wound in his heart. Still, he pushed himself to ride, to work, to serve. He refused to rest, perhaps because rest meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. By 1867, his health began to fail quickly. Josefa cared for him night and day, never leaving his side. He told her stories from his youth, about his first mountain hunt, his days with Fremont, and the rivers he had crossed. She listened with a smile, though her eyes carried worry. Kit Carson had traveled farther than any man of his time. But in the end, every trail leads home. By the late 1860s, Kit Carson had lived more than most men could in 10 lifetimes. He had guided explorers across mountains that had no names, fought in wars that shaped a nation, and seen the rise and fall of empires on the edge of the American frontier. But now, in his final years, Carson faced the one battle he could not escape: time itself. He was no longer the strong mountain man who once crossed the Rockies on horseback. His hair had turned silver, his steps had grown slow, and the spark in his eyes had softened into quiet reflection. Still, when people visited him, they were struck by the same calm presence. The man who had once tamed the wild still carried the wilderness in his soul. In the small community of Boggsville, Colorado, Kit Carson tried to live simply. He farmed a little land, repaired saddles, and spent his evenings beside his wife, Josefa, and their children. After decades of war and loss, this small corner of peace was his reward. He had no need for fame, no desire for adventure. All he wanted was to watch his children grow, hear laughter in the house, and sleep without the sound of marching boots or crying wind. But even here, far from Washington and its politics, his legend found him. Visitors traveled hundreds of miles just to shake his hand. Writers and reporters came to ask questions about the old days. They wanted stories of gunfights, bear hunts, and battles. They wanted the hero of the dime novels, the fearless frontiersman who never lost. Carson, polite but reserved, would smile quietly. He never corrected them, but he never played the part they wanted either. He would say softly, "The West isn't as wild as folks like to tell it. It's just hard and real." Many left disappointed, not realizing that behind his silence was wisdom, not weakness. Dime novels had turned him into something larger than life. They called him the Lion of the Frontier, the Invincible Scout, the Slayer of Savages. They printed wild tales of him wrestling grizzly bears with his bare hands, or single-handedly fighting armies. None of it was true. The real Kit Carson hated those stories. He wasn't proud of killing, nor did he enjoy the fame that painted him as a hero. He once told a friend, "If people knew what it cost, they'd not envy me at all." He knew the truth. The frontier didn't make heroes. It made survivors. Despite his humble life, duty still found him now and then. In his last years, he was asked to help negotiate treaties with native tribes, using his reputation to build trust. The Ute and Jicarilla Apache people respected him because he treated them as equals. He no longer saw them as enemies, but as fellow souls struggling to survive a world that was vanishing beneath them. He often brought food and supplies to native camps, arguing with army officers who wanted to withhold them. Some officers saw him as soft, but Kit didn't care. He knew the cost of cruelty too well. "Mercy," he once said, "is braver than any bullet." But while he fought for peace, his own health was failing. Years of cold nights, hunger, and hardship had left deep marks on his body. He suffered from chest pains and weakness, often coughing through the nights. Doctors told him his heart was failing, an aortic aneurysm, they said, but he ignored their warnings. He still worked, still rode, still helped his neighbors. He couldn't rest. Rest made him feel old, and Kit Carson had never known how to be still. Even as his body weakened, his spirit stayed fierce. He once joked to a friend, "I reckon I'll rest when the mountains do." But in April 1868, tragedy struck again. Josefa, the love of his life, went into labor with their 8th child. The birth was hard, and within hours she fell gravely ill. Kit stayed by her side, holding her hand, whispering that she would be all right. But by morning, she was gone. Carson was devastated. The woman who had been his anchor through every storm was gone. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. Friends said he aged 10 years overnight. He refused to leave the house for days, sitting beside her empty bed, whispering her name as though she might still hear him. When asked how he was, he said only, "Half of me is gone." In the weeks that followed, his own health declined rapidly. He coughed blood, grew too weak to walk far, and often spoke of seeing Josefa in his dreams. He knew his time was near, but he wasn't afraid. He had seen death too many times to fear it. He asked his children to gather near and told them the story of his life, not the battles or the glory, but the lessons. He told them to be kind, to respect the land, and to live in peace. He warned them not to believe the stories written about him. "I was never what they say," he said softly. "I just tried to do what was right, even when I failed." His words were not grand, but they were true. In that quiet moment, the legend finally became a man again. On May 23, 1868, Kit Carson took his last breath at Fort Lyon, Colorado. He was 58 years old. His final words were simple: "Goodbye, friends. Adios, compadres." He was buried beside Josefa in Taos, the town that had given him love, home, and peace. Thousands attended his funeral. Soldiers, settlers, and native people alike came to pay their respects. The man who had once been both feared and admired was now remembered simply as Kit, the scout, the husband, the father, the man who walked between two worlds. After his death, his legend only grew. Cities, counties, and mountains were named after him. Statues rose in his honor. But with time, historians began to question the myth. Was he a hero or a destroyer? A man of peace or a soldier of conquest? The truth, like the land he loved, was not simple. Kit Carson was both. He was brave and flawed, compassionate and hardened, gentle and fierce. He carried the spirit of his age, its courage, its cruelty, and its contradictions. He once said, "The West is not what it looks like in books. It's what it does to a man." And in the end, that was Kit Carson's story. A man shaped by the wild, scarred by war, and remembered by history not for perfection, but for endurance. When Kit Carson died in May of 1868, the world did not fall silent. It began to tell stories. From the deserts of New Mexico to the crowded streets of New York, his name spread like wind across the plains. The man who once guided explorers through uncharted lands was now a legend whose footsteps echoed in every corner of the American West. But legends have a way of growing larger, and sometimes farther from the truth. In the years after his death, Kit Carson became more than a man. He became a symbol of the frontier itself, its courage, its struggle, and its contradictions. To some, he was a hero who embodied American bravery. To others, he was a reminder of the suffering that came with westward expansion. History, like the desert, offered no clear answers. Newspapers printed stories of his daring adventures, and dime novels painted him as a near-mythic warrior, the fearless trapper who fought bears with knives, outwitted entire tribes, and rode through gunfire untouched. Those who had known the real Kit Carson could only shake their heads. The truth was simpler and far more human. He was not a man of glory. He was a man of endurance. Carson's grave in Taos, New Mexico, soon became a place of pilgrimage. Travelers stopped to pay respects. Some left coins, others left flowers, and a few whispered prayers for a man they had never met. They came seeking the spirit of the West, the courage to face the unknown. His friends said he would have been embarrassed by all the attention. He never saw himself as a hero, only as someone who did his duty. If he could have spoken from his grave, he might have said, "I never asked to be famous. I only wanted to survive." But even as the legend grew, so did the debate. Historians began to dig beneath the surface, separating fact from fiction. They wrote about his role in the Navajo Long Walk, questioning whether duty could ever justify such suffering. Some condemned him as the hand of cruelty, the soldier who carried out orders that broke a nation. Others defended him as a man of his time, a soldier bound by command, not hatred. The truth, as always, lived in the space between. Carson had lived by his conscience, but his world was shaped by forces larger than himself: politics, expansion, and the hunger for land. He was both a participant and a witness in an age when progress and destruction walked side by side. Despite the controversies, his story refused to fade. Schools, towns, and counties were named after him: Carson City, Carson County, Carson National Forest. Each name carried both pride and complexity. He was woven into the fabric of the nation's memory, sometimes celebrated, sometimes questioned, but never forgotten. Artists painted him as a lone rider against the sunset. Filmmakers turned his life into tales of adventure. In the imagination of America, he remained forever young, riding across open plains, guiding lost travelers, and living free under the endless western sky. But history slowly began to reclaim the man from the myth. Researchers discovered letters that showed his compassion for native people, his attempts to feed starving tribes, his frustration with the government's broken promises. They also found military reports, cold, factual, and painful, that tied him to campaigns that brought despair. Together, they formed the portrait of a man who was both hero and human. In modern times, Kit Carson's name continues to stir conversation. Monuments dedicated to him stand tall, but some have faced calls for removal, as new generations question old stories. To them, Carson's legacy is not simple bravery. It is a mirror of America's frontier past, filled with both triumph and tragedy. And perhaps that is what makes his story timeless. Because Kit Carson was never a flawless hero. He was a man trying to find balance between duty and conscience, between loyalty and compassion. He lived in a world where every choice carried consequence, and he bore those consequences quietly until the end. Those who study him today see not just the soldier or the scout, but the symbol of an era that shaped the soul of a nation. He represents the restless spirit that drove people west, the hunger for discovery, the dream of freedom, and the shadow of its cost. When people visit Taos now, they still find his grave beneath the cottonwood trees. Beside him lies Josefa, the woman who gave him peace. Their resting place is simple: no marble, no gold, just stone, earth, and sunlight, the same elements that shaped his life. Visitors often stand there quietly, thinking about the world he lived in, the world he helped build and break. And if the wind is right, it almost feels as if his voice still rides on it, not as a legend, not as a hero, but as a man who walked the line between two worlds and carried the burden of both. Kit Carson once said, "The West is for those who are not afraid to lose themselves." And lose himself he did, into history, into myth, into memory. His journey ended long ago, but the trail he carved remains, a path through wilderness, through war, and through the heart of a country still trying to understand itself. When the dust of the 1800s finally settled, the name Kit Carson remained, etched into maps, towns, and the memory of a nation still wrestling with what it had become. More than a century after his death, people still speak his name with a mix of awe and uncertainty. Because Kit Carson's legacy, like the land he roamed, is vast, harsh, and beautiful, all at once. He was born in a small Kentucky cabin and died in a soldier's bed in Colorado. Between those 2 points stretched a life that mirrored America's own story: innocence, ambition, courage, and guilt. He helped explore the West, guide settlers, and build the foundations of a new nation. Yet, his journey also carried the shadows of conquest and sorrow. To understand Kit Carson is to understand the birth of the American West itself, a place where opportunity and tragedy walked hand in hand. In the decades after his death, generations of Americans grew up reading about him. To them, he was the ultimate frontiersman, the brave scout, the man who opened the wilderness, the hero who never feared the unknown. But history, as it matured, began to look deeper. People started to ask questions. Who paid the price for that expansion? Whose homes were taken? Whose voices were silenced while legends were born? And that's where Carson's story becomes more than just a biography. It becomes a mirror reflecting the soul of a country learning to tell the truth about itself. Carson's name can still be found across America. Carson City stands proud as the capital of Nevada. Carson National Forest stretches through northern New Mexico, its pine-covered hills not far from where he once lived and died. Monuments rise in his honor, and schools still carry his name. Yet in recent years, many have stopped to look at those same monuments and ask, what do we remember and what do we forget? Because the story of Kit Carson is not just one of bravery, it's one of consequence. His service in the Navajo Long Walk remains one of the darkest stains in Western history. and acknowledging that truth does not erase his courage. It simply completes it. If there is one thing his life teaches, it is this: legends are never pure. They are made of light and shadow, of triumph and failure. Carson was a man of deep contradictions, both a rescuer and a destroyer, both friend and foe to the people of the land. He lived by duty but died with doubt, and perhaps that is why his story endures, because it is human. Historians now see Kit Carson as a bridge between worlds. He connected the old wilderness with the modern age, the native with the newcomer, and the untamed with the civilized. He was neither saint nor villain. He was something far rarer, a man trying to do right in a time when right and wrong were blurred by survival. When he guided John C. Fremont across the Rockies, he opened doors that led to states, cities, and millions of lives. When he led the Navajo campaign, he also opened wounds that still ache today. Both are true. Both must be remembered. Because history's duty is not to worship, but to understand. In Taos, at his modest gravesite, the world feels quieter. There are no speeches, no crowds. Just wind moving through cottonwood trees and sunlight falling on old stone. The grave reads simply, Kit Carson, soldier, explorer, pioneer. But those words, small and carved in fading granite, cannot hold the size of his story. He was more than what he did. He was what his life revealed about a country in motion, a country that believed it could conquer mountains and deserts, and in doing so discovered both greatness and guilt. If Kit Carson were alive today, he might not recognize the world he helped shape, but he would recognize the spirit that still drives it, the desire to explore, to reach farther, to build something lasting, even in the face of mistakes. That spirit was his gift to the generations that followed. He taught that bravery is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to go forward despite it. He taught that even flawed men can build great things, and that even heroes must face the truth of what their courage costs. The Wild West has long vanished. The open plains have roads now, and the rivers he once crossed have bridges. But the lessons of that age remain. The courage to begin, the humility to learn, the honesty to look back. Kit Carson's life reminds us that history is not just about victory. It's about reflection. It's about asking not only what we achieved, but what we lost along the way. His legend will continue to evolve, retold, re-examined, reimagined. Each generation will see him through its own eyes, as a hero, a soldier, a husband, a flawed man who helped shape a nation's soul. And maybe that's the truest legacy of all, that even when the myths fade, the story still matters. Because the story of Kit Carson is not just about one man. It's about all of us, our courage, our contradictions, our desire to find meaning in the wild journey called history. Kit Carson's trail ended long ago, but the horizon he chased still stretches on, endless, untamed, and waiting for the next traveler brave enough to follow it.